Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. Today we're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance for one of their celebrity lectures. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Welcome to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Macha, the director for the museum. Now, I didn't feel it was right for me to introduce my own brother today, so I've asked one of our dedicated interns, Josh Dondick of Torrance High School, to do the honors.
One of the often and proud unsung companies that contributed to the great legacy of the Southern California aerospace industry was Vultee Aircraft. We are privileged today to have 4 examples of Vultee's fine engineering and manufacturing capabilities. We are also privileged to have the services of one of the leading authorities on Southern California aviation history, who will provide us with a historical perspective on this fine company. It is my privilege, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce Mr. G. Pat Macha.
Well done. Thanks for that introduction. Well, this is a new venue for me, but Vultees have been near and dear to my heart for many years because the unsung heroes of the Second World War are the training aircraft that got people into the fighters and bombers. And the BT-13 was responsible for training more than one quarter of a million airmen and women. And it served here with, of course, our United States Army Air Corps, Air Force, and for a short time, a few in the regular Air Force. But it also served in many of the countries in South America, Central America, and Mexico, not to mention overseas as well. Southern California, as was said, was at one time the center of the aviation industry, and we need to be reminded as time goes on, and we want people to know that right here in the LA Basin we had Lockheed, and we had Douglas, and we had North American, and we had Vultee, we had Northrop, and in San Diego we had Ryan, and we had Consolidated Aircraft. Now back east they had Republic, and they had Grumman, and they had Curtiss. But this is where the action was, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond. So with that, we're going to take a look here a little bit about Gerard Jerry Fairbairn Vultee. And you can see he's almost a century kid. He was born in 1900 and died tragically very early in a crash in 1938. But he is the gentleman that got that company going. He worked with Jack Northrop at Lockheed. They worked on the Vega project together. And then he got together with CL Cord Automobiles, and a corporation called the American Airplane Development Corporation, which then led to Vultee Aircraft. And his early designs were under that auspices, but they were always called Vultee. Now, one thing that I was looking into was his last name, and I have not been able to find out what country of origin Vultee comes from, except possibly France or Belgium. But does anybody in the audience know by chance? Yeah, that's a little mystery I'd like to have solved. My wife, Mary Jane, is advancing the photos for me, and there's a picture taken many years ago of Jerry Vultee. Mary Jane helped me put this PowerPoint together. Without her, I could not have accomplished the mission, believe me. His first design, 1932-33, the Vultee V1, and this was an 8-passenger, all-metal, retractable gear airliner, 1 pilot, so 9 people on board, and it could cruise at a respectable 195 miles an hour. Now, American Airlines bought some, but it was the favorite of corporations as the first really luxurious executive aircraft. So a number of corporate people picked it up. Hearst had one, and they also went overseas and were used during the Spanish Civil War. They were operated both by the Nationalists and by the Republican forces, modified into bombers, attack aircraft. Machine guns were put on them. Lady Peace is a famous V1 because Jimmy Doolittle used that aircraft to set some impressive records. And that's a picture of that bird as it remains today. Thankfully, we still have an example of the V1 with us. Now, the airplane that really got things going for Vultee, the manufacturing, by the way, was initiated at Grand Central Air Terminal in Glendale. And then later they moved down to Downey and built the big factory there. But the first of the V11 Attack Bombers was built up in Glendale, and then assembly came on down to the Downey facility. Nice clean airplane, all metal, retractable gear with a crew of 3. So you had a pilot and you had a gunner up top in the aft. He had a .30 caliber gun, and the airplane carried 4 .30s firing forward, and then there was a gunner down in the belly, a ventral position with a .30 caliber gun. Now, Vultee had hoped to sell this airplane to the United States Army Air Corps, and they bought 7 for test, and they just didn't warm up to it. Then they bought 2 more, what they call A models, as engine test beds. But the airplane was successful as far as overseas sales were concerned, and Brazil picked up quite a few. The airplane sold to Turkey, which operated the type into the early 1950s. Still had some flying. The aircraft also was sold to the Russians. That's the A model with a little different tail, and you can see the big inline engine on it. This is for the Brazilian Navy, so it could operate on floats. Now, Vultee is the gentleman on the second, there on the right side. He's the second guy in. And he's surrounded by 3 Russian aviators who had come to finalize a contract for the V11 light bomber attack aircraft. These 3 men later went on to great fame by flying an Antonov ANT-25 from Moscow nonstop. They were trying to reach San Diego, but because of fog in San Diego, they landed at San Jacinto, California, near Hemet. The airplane was disassembled and shipped back to the Soviet Union. So the Russians got a license to build enough of these to equip a full squadron with spares, plus they picked up 5 that were built here in Downey. Now, Stenson, of course, figures into our story as well, because later Stenson will be picked up by Consolidated Aircraft, just as Vultee will be also. But Jerry Vultee owned and operated a Stenson Reliant, one of the SR series. It was a luxurious airplane for its day. Powerful, it could seat 5 people in comfort. It was used in the Second World War as an instrument trainer and as a light transport by both the Navy and primarily the Army Air Force. And then many services overseas. The Brits picked up quite a lot of these. And it was in that airplane, an airplane similar to what you saw, that Jerry Vultee was killed along with his wife on January 29th, 1938. And he had flown back to Washington, D.C. to try to really get the War Department to take a serious look at his attack bomber, his A-19, and to sell it and to push it. And as he was flying back home over Arizona, they ran into bad weather. Now, he was not an IFR-rated pilot, so he entered severe weather north of Sedona, Arizona, and tragically crashed to his death, killing he and his wife, Sylvia. So you see the tail feathers of that airplane at the crash site, burned, fabric is gone, and you can see the tail wheel there. And then I think a close-up of that tail wheel assembly. If you go up to Sedona, north of Sedona there's a marker on the highway that says Vultee Arch. And we have flown over that, paying our respects to Mr. Vultee. And you can see it clearly from the air. We did that in a Cessna 206. So there's the arch and the Vultee Arch Trail. To get to the crash site, that's a pretty lengthy hike beyond that point. There is a memorial marker there as well, remembering Jerry Vultee and his contributions to aviation technology and history. So then there were a couple of the V11 airplanes that were highly modified for test purposes, V11B and the V11T. And you can see in the foreground that V11T. Pratt & Whitney used this airplane to test a number of different power plant installations. And then the V11 that you see in the background was also used for numerous tests in the early 1940s. Now the BC-3 Basic Combat Trainer, in 1940, the Army Air Corps issued a spec for a competition for a trainer that could help pilots learn to fly fighter planes, basic combat, and it had to have retractable landing gear, it had to be all metal, and it had to be fast. So North American Aviation entered the competition with the BC-1 and BC-2, and Vultee entered it with the BC-3. North American Aviation won the contract, and those BC-1s and 2s became the AT-6 Texan trainer, which went on to be an advanced trainer. So here's the prototype, the one and only BC-3 built by Vultee. Now this photo came out of my dad's toolbox. When he left the Army in Texas in 1939, he came west to get work in the aircraft factories. But he went to school first at the Glendale Technical College at Grand Central, and while he was there, he got this nice toolbox, and he had this picture inside the box, and that's something I've treasured because it's got his name on it, and a bunch of his buddies have signed it. And you can see on that the BC-3 looks pretty good at that point. She had a .30 caliber gun shooting through the prop, and the guy in the back seat had a .30 caliber swivel gun. And then you've got an observation window there on the belly of the airplane. Back in World War II, you know, when people built airplanes, the folks constructing those airplanes loved to sign things. And I've been to enough crash sites where I find the pencil markings, their signatures inside, and messages to the, to the crew. Sock it to them, give them hell, win the war. V for victory. And you see those little pencil things in there. And it happened all over the place. So the BC-3 did lead to a very successful design for Vultee, and that's the BT-13 Valiant. Now from here on, we pick up some Vultee aircraft with a name. They give it a name. And Prince Valiant was big in the comic strips back in those days, and there you have Valiant. And here's the first BT, and that's a straight BT-13. And it had the fairings on the landing gear legs to make it a little bit faster. It's not an A model, it's not a B model, it's not a BT-15. Now, thanks to Bruce Guberman, we have a very rare little video here we're going to run. It takes about 4 minutes of the Vultee factory in Downey, California, about late 1940, early 41. The Stenson factory was located back in Michigan at Wayne County Airport, and they built some fine airplanes. The SM-1 Detroiter, a hallmark landmark airplane, was the V-77 Reliant, the Gull Wing. Jerry Vultee owned one of these. It served during the war as the AT-19 as an instrument trainer. Fine aircraft. This was also the home of production of the Stenson 105, which did serve during the Second World War with the Civil Air Patrol, and used for coastal anti-sub flights, and they flew along the Mexican border. And then after the war, they came up with the 107, 108s, and they were very, very successful, the Voyager and the station wagon. So we're doing a little prop start here, wood prop. Rare airplane today, not too many 105s are left in existence. Wheels bats. See the November Charlie registry. So out in California at the Vultee factory, production was ramping up with the BT-13, which was just the straight BT again, and that has the fairings over the landing gear leg. And of course, as production went on, they ditched those probably because of cost and also maintenance issues. They found out it didn't really change the handling characteristics or speed of the airplane in any real substantial way. The beautiful paint scheme of the period, the old Army blue fuselage, yellow wings, and vertical and horizontal stabilizer, high visibility. And that went away as the war came on. By 1942, everything was going bare metal. Save the paint, keep the airplane lighter, and roll them out as fast as possible. But nice, clean airplane, beautiful. Running up here, they do the check flights before the aircraft were handed over to the Army. And so here's a Vultee company test pilot. And they would average about an hour and a half minimum of flight with the aircraft, put it through the paces, bring it back. Sometimes flights would last up to 3 hours before delivery. Vultee Field made for a fine airstrip. There were 2 4,000-foot runways. And of course, during the war, Vultee was merged with Consolidated. Consolidated Vultee later became Convair. This was where those BTs were built, and this place was running 24/7 for most of the war years. The Vultee BT-13, BT-13A, and BT-13B, and BT-15 were all produced here. Another good shot of the early paint job, and occasionally they'd have mass flyouts. So you'd have 30, 40, 50 aircraft ready to be delivered. The Army pilots would show up, and away they would go. And of course, during the war, they created within the Air Transport Command the Ferry Command to manage this activity. And that's where the WASP pilots became so important in late 43, 44 to help assist in the delivery of factory fresh aircraft. Fine color footage, very rare. You can see the red panel there where the fire extinguisher was kept. Now here's a shot taken maybe at that same time or shortly after, and obviously a stage shot. You've got 2 guys looking up at an airplane flying over. And again, you've got these early variant BTs that are prepared for delivery. This is probably 1941. And here's a BT-13, and this is a B model, and this has a wooden empennage. That is, from behind the aft cockpit, she's all wood because that was to conserve strategic materials. The outer wing panels were wood, again to conserve strategic materials, aluminum. So the A model is an all aluminum bird, and some of the B models were built all aluminum as well. But there were some in that series that were wood. Another great shot, and we have to be reminded too, you know, the Navy flew the BT and they called it the SNV-1 and the SNV-2. A beautiful shot with snow-capped mountains of Southern California in the background. And that being an SNV-2 is also an airplane there with the wooden empennage on it. A nice shot from about 1942 with the BTs peeling off there. And a good shot of the assembly line. Right here in California, we had many, many air bases where BTs were assigned. And that included bases out on the Antelope Valley, where Fox Field is today, and a bunch of ancillary fields around there, up at Minter Field and where Lemoore Naval Air Station is. We had BTs everywhere, and of course California was great for flight training because of the weather. They were also based in Arizona, Texas, Florida, Mississippi, Georgia. That's where you found the greatest concentration of BT-13s. We also have to be reminded that when men went to war, women went to work. And they built those airplanes, not just Vultee airplanes, but every manufacturer had truckloads of ladies that came in and worked 7 days a week. Those lines went 7 days a week, 24/7. Now, this was at a gathering when the 10,000th BT-13 was rolled out. And over on the left is Grandma BT-13, and that's one of the straight BT-13s. And Grandpa, number 10,000, we don't see him, but we will in a minute. Number 10,000, altogether, as Bruce Guberman has reminded me, 11,538, Bruce, or was it 36? 37. But this was a very successful aircraft, and boy, it kept Vultee just humming. And so when that airplane was to be delivered, they brought in a women's Air Force service pilot, Barbara Erickson. And there she is in the cockpit with a Air Force officer, and she's getting her briefing. She's going to take that airplane from the Vultee field to some active base for delivery. And here is Shirley Slade, another women's Air Force service pilot. There were only 1,100 of these ladies, but they gave good service during the Second World War to us, and as you know, they wore uniforms, but they were not in the military. They did not have dog tags. If they lost their life or were injured in service, their family had to pay for the burial or for hospitalization. And if the family didn't have the money, then their sister WASPs would scrape it together and take care of them that way. 38 of these women did lose their lives in good service to our nation. Shirley Slade on the back of a BT-13. Now this is a more recent photo, but it's a Navy SNV painted up as the Navy did their trainers in 1940-41. And then as we got into the war, they got away from the paint for a number of reasons. It was costly, made the airplane heavier, it was just easier to leave them natural aluminum bare metal. An Air Force general at the Downey plant with two of the women working there on a leading edge of a wing assembly perhaps, asking a few questions, I'm sure. Now, another airplane that was developed at this time was the P-66 Vanguard. So we have the Valiant, now we have Vanguard, a fighter plane. And this airplane was, you can see one, you've got BTs on the assembly line there, but right at the bottom of the picture you have a P-66. The government of Sweden wanted to buy 146 of these. Vultee said, we can do it. Initially, the U.S. government approved it. But when war broke out, because Sweden was a neutral nation, the U.S. decided to retain those P-66s here. And instead, they went other places. At this time, too, in 1942, Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego bought Vultee, and it became Consolidated Vultee. And they also bought out Stenson. So Consolidated was running the show, and Carl Kozlow was a man that a friend of mine knew, and he was a very important guy at Vultee at that time. And there's his badge, Consolidated Vultee. He's the division manager. That's up there. He lived in Corona Del Mar, and when he passed on, his wife gave all of his Vultee memorabilia to this gentleman that I happen to know. Now here we see a Vanguard in Royal Air Force markings, but they never went to the Royal Air Force. They were painted up that way for publicity photos, but where they did go was to China, where they did see operational combat service. And this airplane carried two 50 caliber guns in the nose cowling and four 30 calibers, two in each wing. And here we see some P-66s in U.S. service. They were used stateside here as fighter trainers, and I've never seen a photo where they actually had the armament on them. So they were teaching advanced combat tactics without guns. Another airplane that had a foreign beginning, the French government wanted to buy the Vengeance dive bomber. the A-31 and the A-35. So here's another Vultee design with a letter V, Vengeance. Valiant, Vanguard, Vengeance. When France fell, the British government, the RAF, picked up their order, and the airplanes were delivered to the RAF and went from there on to Australia. And then the US got into the act as well. So there's an early Vengeance with 4 50 calibers firing forward and either 2 50s in the back for the gunner or a single 50 cal. Manufacturing of this aircraft could not be handled entirely in Downey. So Northrop got a contract to build the Vengeance in Hawthorne, and Downey opened another factory in Nashville, Tennessee, where the Vultee Vengeance was built as well. That's a good shot of it. The bombs were carried internally in a bomb bay. It goes into a dive, the bomb bay doors open, the bomb swings out on a trapeze, clearing the propeller, and away you go. And then one bomb under each wing. Just under 2,000 Vengeance dive bombers were built. And a good shot there. Unusual wing layout, and you notice the landing gear retracts as the P-40 did. It swiveled, or the Grumman F6F Hellcat. Now, in landing this airplane, she was kind of heavy, and if you weren't on the numbers with it or you braked too hard, you could collapse that landing gear. They had troubles with that. Here we see Vengeance dive bombers in Royal Air Force markings. In the Royal Air Force, they served in India, China, Burma theater of operations. And then our allies in Australia flew them in the heavy and brutal combat in New Guinea and the Southwest Pacific. The United States Army Air Force flew the Vengeance also, but did not use it operationally. They used it for target towing and training, essentially. And when the war ended, they disappeared quickly from service. Now, Vultee came up with some very unusual fighter designs. The XP-54, called the Swoosh Goose, is the first. It had no formal Vultee name. Very unusual, big airplane. 2 50 caliber machine guns and 2 37 millimeter cannons in the nose. Talk about firepower. Notice the inline liquid-cooled power plant is aft, and that presented a problem for pilot escape from the aircraft. They did not have ejection seats at that time. In fact, it was Sweden who developed the first actual ejection seat. And the way they got this guy out of the airplane was he had a downward falling seat that would throw him out on a trapeze and hurl him below the airplane, which was fine as long as you were several thousand feet above the ground. Radical, innovative, very unusual, but too complicated, and it would take quite a while to get this thing into production, so it was used for test purposes only. Then came the XA-41 attack aircraft, very large. Here we go, let's see, 4 50 caliber guns and 2 37 millimeter cannons or 2 20 millimeter cannons. They had variable combinations of armament, 1-man crew, big bomb load, not very attractive airplane. Just an observation. You can see how large that thing is. A big Pratt & Whitney power plant there, and once again the Army Air Force elected not to enter this aircraft into production. Then came the XP-81 fighter design, and the XP-81, we'll take a look at that next. This had a Merlin engine in the nose. The first prototype did, and it had a turbojet engine aft. So it was a combination fighter, and underneath the wings you can see slipper tanks. Those are fuel tanks. There's the outline. Again, a rather unusual nose shape. The performance on this aircraft left quite a bit to be desired. It was heavy, and maintenance people said, well, you're giving us a problem here because we have to deal with a reciprocating engine and a jet engine. Now, the only airplane that ever was halfway successful with that layout was the Ryan FR-1 Fireball that the Navy used after World War II in the 40s that had a prop up front and a jet tailpipe in the back. And those fireball pilots could feather their prop and be flying along just on the jet. And if people didn't know what they were looking at, that could really shake up people on the ground or other pilots in the vicinity. But they did clean it up, and they put a different engine in. General Electric designed a power plant that made the airplane much more streamlined, and at altitude it could really move. It could get up around 500 miles an hour. But basically, the P-51 was in mass production. The P-51 had the range, the speed, the altitude, and it was doing the job beautifully in the Pacific. They were thinking this airplane might escort the B-29 bombers, but the 51s were doing that too. And so it did not go into production, the XP-81. And here's a shot of a Vultee test pilot out at Muroc, which is now Edwards Air Force Base, where they did all the flight test work on these birds. And a nice in-flight shot. That airplane has been preserved. So we have that. We don't have an XP-54 to look at today. Now, after the war, there was no need. In the immediate years after the war, everybody was demobilizing. The basic trainer, by 1947, when the Air Force was established, they said, we're doing primary, and really we're moving into a primary to almost advanced situation. So we're going to have the T-6 Texan, number 1, and then on to operational trainers, although they did use light, like let's say Piper Cubs at one time, L-21s for some of the ab initio training for screening of pilots. But the BT-13 was no longer needed, so thousands of them were either cut up and smelted down for aluminum value, or they were sold surplus. And I was told that you could pick up one of these aircraft for $500 to maybe up to as high as $800, between $500 and $800. So, and you could get T-6 Texans, you could get P-51s, P-38s, P-47s. Sadly, more people didn't buy P-38s, right, Joe? Yeah. Or P-47s or P-61s, a few did, but most of them went to the scrapper. Some went overseas to our allies. And again, a lot of those birds went down to South America. So here we have a BT with a spinner, and I don't know if that one has the larger power plant. Sometimes people would pep it up and they would, it had a 985 standard. And then people would put a T6 power plant in there to up it a little bit. And I didn't mention the BT-15, which looking at one on the ground, you wouldn't know to the untrained eye, you're looking at a BT-15, just like a BT-13, except it had a Wright power plant on board. So here's another civilian bird, spinner, and the Army never flew them with the spinner. Here's one modified for agricultural application, a spray airplane. And the single seat instead of 2-seat, and if he flips it over, he's got a turnover bar. Now listen, there's lots of BT accidents around the mountains of the West. Surplus with November, civil registries. People would grab those. Guys that weren't necessarily pilots during the war, they'd take a few lessons, they'd take off. This airplane was going to Las Vegas from the San Fernando Valley, and he was trying to follow the road that is now the 14 freeway, and he hit a ridge out there and killed himself. Got a little cloudy, and he was IFR, I follow roads. But the BT also became famous in the movie Tora Tora Tora, because the Val dive bombers that were used in the movie were manufactured from BTs, and they looked pretty darn close. I mean, that was a great choice there. T6s became Zeros, and then T6 modifications became the level bomber or torpedo bomber. There's another bird from Tora Tora. That's a great shot, Bonsai. Now this BT was not in Tora Tora. Somebody got the idea, they painted their airplane in those colors. I like what I see right out here, United States military markings, as they should be. Wonderful. Here's one as a German fighter reduced to a single seater. And look, oh man, shortened that body, I guess. Here's one that's almost perfectly accurate except for the November registry on the fuselage. Otherwise, that's how it looked in, 40, 41, early 42. And another great shot of a BT that might have appeared that way in late 42, 43. Another great shot. And Bruce Guberman with his BT that's right outside the hangar. And Bruce is saying, Pat, why don't you climb in here? Let's go for a ride. And I said, you bet. And there I am in the back seat, and I had a blast. I never closed that canopy. It's wonderful. There's no air coming back in there, unless you do this, stick your hand out. And my nephew, Corey Macha, is here today. He's going to fly back this afternoon with Bruce to Van Nuys. So he's going to have the thrill of a lifetime in that bird. So we're looking back through history. We look at a couple models there, the BT-13. We're remembering Vultee aircraft and their great contribution to aerospace in Southern California and in our nation. And remember Jerry Vultee. And we have with us today a relative of Don Smith, who was the vice president of Vultee Aircraft at one time, John Kelch. And John, would you stand up just for a minute, please? So we have a living connection right here with Vultee Aircraft. Recommended reading, the best book out there by Jonathan Thompson, Vultee Aircraft, 1932 to 47. Remember that Vultee became Consolidated Vultee, became Convair, became General Dynamics Corporation. So we want to remember the sequence there. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and if you have any questions, we'll take a few minutes for it. The question.
You mentioned the EL Cord and its relationship with Jerry Vultee. Well, my hometown was Cartersville, Indiana. That's where they built the Auburn Cord automobile. During the war, it was called Auburn Central.
Fantastic. No, that's great. That's great. So the Cord automobile manufacturing plant became a manufacturing plant for subassemblies on both the BT-13, the A-35 Vengeance, and the B-24 bomber. And your dad was an inspector. And
Hi, I'm Lloyd Kenworthy, and he mentioned the EL Cord and his relationship with Jerry Vultee. EL Cord had a factory building Auburn and Cord automobiles in my hometown of Connersville, Indiana. And so during the war, they quit building Cords and Auburn automobiles and transitioned into building Vultee wings. They built the BT-13 wings, the Vultee Vengeance wings, and the outer sections of the Consolidated Vultee B-24s there. My father got involved with the factory as an inspector. He went out to get the job. He was a school principal in town, and everybody worked on extra jobs in the factory. It went, like you said, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And they asked him if he knew anything about loading boxcars. Well, all these boxcars that they were using were from the automobile industry that was there, and they had racks to hold the cars in place. Well, they loaded wings in there, and some of these racks would break loose and damage the wings. So he was in there to inspect that. The reason he got the job because he used to load feed sacks in his father's grain elevator. And so that was enough qualification. He later became inspector on the wings, and he had the stamp number of AC, which originally was Auburn Cord. That became American Central. No, not Auburn Cord, Auburn Central. Later became the American Central Manufacturing, which built the wings. His number was number 88. When I was in Sikeston, Missouri, or alternate field for Malden, Missouri, when I was going through aviation cadets, I saw a disassembled BT-13. So I went over and looked at the inspection plate, and my father's stamp was on there, AC-88. So I just thought I'd pass it a little long about some of the manufacturing that went on for the Vultee airplanes all over the country.
Thank you very much. That's great. That's a little piece of history. And we have another inspector here, and that's Joe Honesty. He was an inspector at Rockwell, North American Aviation. And those inspectors are important people. When they put their stamp on something, it's got to be good, approved, the seal. Joe's also a P-38 pilot. flew in Italy in the Second World War. Next question, please. Search. We did mention the SNV 1 and 2 for the Navy. And that's why we say 250,000 airmen and women were trained on that airplane. But thank you very much for that input. Pardon? Was one of those trained, exactly. Flew the BT. How many people in here have flown the BT-13? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. All right. Next question. Yes, Corey. You know, I'd have to defer to a BT-13 pilot on that, whether the tail section was only held on by 3 bolts. Your question, and they were limited in terms of aerobatic maneuvers. I don't know that they were supposed to do spins in the BT, but Bruce or one of our BT pilots, can anybody answer that question? Yeah, come on down and please come down and be on camera for that answer. Was the BT restricted in any way, let's say spins or aerobatic maneuvers?
Yes, my name is Ken Borman, and from Monterey area. I have the blue and yellow early 42, 41 colors out there. My airplane actually was, when it came off the assembly line in 45 as a BT-13B, was actually not painted, or painted, some parts were painted silver. But when I restored it, I brought it back to those colors because I like those colors. So sorry, it's not totally authentic, but I like the way it looks. But your question about the, first of all, the tail is attached to the monocoque. It's a monocoque tail section that's attached to the chromoly steel frame by, it must be 75 bolts. They're smaller bolts, but the whole circumference of the tail is attached that way, so it's not 3 bolts. And they taught all the aerobatics in that loops, rolls, snap rolls. It will not do sustained inverted flight because it has a float type carburetor, so it has to be positive G maneuvers, but snap rolls, barrel rolls. In fact, I have a manual that shows that they used for training in World War II. Most of the people I know do not like to do heavy aerobatics in the airplane that's 65 or 70 years old, so we take it easy on them now. I can do barrel rolls and loops in mine, but I don't like to pull too many G's in it. Especially snap rolls are real hard on them. You know, if you do snap rolls, that's what can really tweak the tail. So we definitely stay away from the snap rolls. But they did do that during the war, and they only expected these airplanes to last a few years or a few months. You know, a lot of them were crashed during the war and in training accidents. So, and to my knowledge, I think there's around 40 different models of the BT-13 still flying and in museums around. So unfortunately, there's not very many of them around. We're fortunate in California to have about 10 that are still flying. Unfortunately, we're only able to get 4 here today, but you don't usually see 4 together, so that's pretty unusual. Any other questions about the BT-13 technical? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. That's much appreciated. And it is good to be reminded that worldwide there's only about 150 of them left. And between 35 and 40, you think, flying. So that's, it's a vanishing breed. We're lucky to have these birds here today.
My name's Ron Gardner, born and raised here. My father came out from Minnesota in '39 and worked at the Downey facility for Vultee from early 1940 through early 1944, and left as the lead man of inspection and went into the Navy at that time. He was very fond of those years. He would tell a story, unfortunately we didn't see it on the show there, of that facility, that anyone that was familiar, during those war years, they had a netting, camouflage netting that some of you may be familiar with, that covered that entire facility, the runways and everything, which was several acres. And I don't know how true this is, my dad would tell me, literally, and I'm believing what he told me, that the planes coming in there for test runs would literally fly in and fly underneath this canopy that from the top resembled orange groves and bare fields. He said it was from the air. He said he could imagine what people thought of seeing this plane come in and then just literally disappear into the facility there. And he later went on in 47 after the Navy. He went and spent another year at that facility and became a lead man of inspection for North American when they continued on. But those years at North with Vultee were very important to him. And I've got a 14-karat gold Vultee pin that he earned while he was there that he was always very proud of. Of all his pins, that was his #1 pin. So I just thought I'd share that.
And maybe to wrap it up for this morning, we have John Kelch. Thank you, John, for coming.
Sure.
And I'd like you to tell us about your family's connection to Vultee aircraft.
Well, so I'll just, I don't have records to back it up, so I just have to kind of tell it in an anecdotal fashion the way it was told to me. But my grandfather was Don Smith, and my understanding was he was the general manager of the Auburn Cord Duesenberg dealership for Los Angeles that was located in Pasadena. And it's probably important in terms of the historical context to understand that E.L. Cord lived in Auburn and built his cars there at the Auburn factory and had purchased Duesenberg and was very big in the automotive industry. But he started to launch into airplanes. His first wife died, and when that happened, my grandmother introduced him immediately to her little sister, and he moved out to the West Coast and built the Cord Haven Mansion in Beverly Hills. So a lot of his involvement in Southern California aerospace had to do with the fact that he transitioned out here when he was remarried. But the story that I've been told is that Don Smith, my grandfather, met Gerald Vultee and was hugely impressed with his skills and with the plane that they had, and promoted him to E.L. Cord, his then brother-in-law, and helped arrange the financing from the Cord Corporation to build the Vultee Aircraft Company. And then there are a number of incidents in regards to the Cord Corporation and in regards to the success of the automobile company and post-depression that caused him to be much more interested in aircraft, and then to ultimately sell off his assets, which was the result of which was the cause of Consolidated acquiring Stinson, which E.L. Cord owned, and Vultee, which E.L. Cord owned as well. You may also know that he was chasing airline contracts, and he started a company called American Airways, or bought it. And there's a really interesting story that comes through a brother-in-law of mine who was a pilot, and they wanted him to join the union, and they passed out a pamphlet to scare the pilots into joining the union, and they cited a story where E.L. Cord was chasing the U.S. mail contract and called all of his pilots together to ask them to have their salaries so that he could be competitive on the contract. They got together and formed a group and refused, and he fired them all and replaced them because there was a surplus of pilots right after World War II. So he was certainly a successful and, some say, ruthless businessman, but he had a tremendous influence in both the automobile manufacturing and aircraft. In Auburn, Indiana, and I'll be going back to Fort Wayne next week for visiting Raytheon, there is a fantastic Auburn Cord Duesenberg museum, which you'd think might be a small museum because it's in a perhaps a town you might not have heard of, but it is a spectacular museum. I would guess $25 million worth of cars, an array of Auburns and Duesenbergs and Cords that you won't find anyplace else. But it's in Auburn, Indiana. It's about 8 miles outside of Fort Wayne. And it's in the original Auburn showroom and factory that's been restored to the 20s motif, and they've brought back a lot of the original chandeliers, and it's just a gorgeous place. I recommend it. But the historian associated with the store is very interested in learning more about the West Coast connections of Cord, because they specialize in the East Coast. And at the last Auburn Cord Duesenberg parade, which happens every Memorial Day, they had a Stinson fly-in there in Auburn. So there's a lot of connections between Stinson and Vultee and East Coast and West Coast and the Cord Corporation's dealings and his attempts to build both an automotive and an airplane empire. When the Cord Corporation sold Vultee, my grandfather and a number of the other officers were then dismissed because they brought in new management, and he went over to Interstate Aircraft and helped rescue Interstate from bankruptcy. So he's in Who's Who in America for Interstate, and I think Vultee is mentioned there as well. So, any questions I could answer? That's as much as I know from the family history. Sorry I don't have any memorabilia or anything with me, but thanks so much.
It was mentioned to me by a gentleman here that the Downey facility has been designated an historic landmark, national landmark, and there is a plaque out there. So it's, and the original office building, there's a little part of it there that's still preserved. Thank you very much for coming today, and thanks for your kind attention. Much appreciated. Get out there, see that B-17, look at these BTs, and talk to the pilots out there. Enjoy a little bit of that. Thank you so much.
I'm here with Bruce Guberman, who just flew in this plane behind us. Bruce, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, this airplane is a Vultee BT-13 built in 1941, and they made 11,537 of these aircraft during World War II. And they built these airplanes between 1939 and they ended the production in the summer of 1944. And these airplanes were used for basic training for cadets during World War II.
Would you give us a tour around?
Sure, we'll take you around the airplane. Okay, over here you have your pitot tube where you get your measurement for airspeed. Here's your landing gear. This airplane has fixed landing gear. It's not retractable gear. Okay, the propeller is a Hamilton standard propeller. It's a constant speed type propeller. And the engine's a Pratt & Whitney 985, and it has 450 horsepower. It's a 9-cylinder engine, radial engine. And with these older engines, one of the main precautions you have to take is prior to start, you need to make sure there's no oil in the bottom cylinders. And normally you do that by pulling the prop through carefully with the mag switch off prior to flight. Make sure that there's no oil down in there. They call that hydraulic lock. It could do serious damage to the engine. This right here is what they call a jack point, and it's fixed on this airplane. So if the airplane needed to be jacked up for maintenance, replacement of tires or brakes, you could put a ground jack on this on both sides and jack the airplane up. Okay, we're down at the tail section here. You can see this is your vertical stabilizer, horizontal stabilizer here, and you have a steerable tail wheel down below there. This is a BT-13A model. On some of the BT-13Bs, they actually had wood fuselages. The aft fuselage section was made out of wood, and that was because they had a shortage of metal during the war. And actually some of these trim tabs would be wood too instead of metal. There really aren't any of those flying around because the parts are impossible to find, and if you did find it, the wood wouldn't be any good. Here's your rudder, and this has a metal trim tab on this one, and of course this has fabric on the rudder here. And this is your tail nav light, which is normally white on this airplane. And again, here's your elevator. If you notice, this airplane has dual elevator trim tabs on this airplane, and of course they work simultaneously up and down together through a lever in the cockpit. We're here in the cockpit of the BT-13, and I'm going to go through some of the instruments that the airplane had during World War II. There are some equipment in here that was not available during that time period. But this is your suction gauge, and the pilot normally would look at this and you'd see 4.6 to 5.2 It should run right about in the middle of the green, and that's going to tell you have the correct amount of suction pressure to drive your instruments, which in this case it would drive the directional gyro, the attitude directional indicator or artificial horizon, and the turn and bank indicator, which is vacuum driven in this one, where some of the more modern day airplanes have electrically driven turn and bank indicators. This is the altimeter, airspeed indicator, vertical speed, magnetic compass. This over here is a hand primer, fuel primer for starting the engine. And this is your manifold pressure. That's a gauge you would use for power settings on the engine. And this is your RPM, which is what the propeller RPM is turning. And this is a navigation aid right here, your VOR ILS receiver. This is cylinder head temperature. And these are some of your engine gauges over here, which this top needle here would be just oil temperature. The left needle over here would be your oil pressure. And the right needle over here would be your fuel pressure on the engine. This is a clock. And of course, we don't have the old World War II type radios. It has more of it's a modern radio, King KX155. And I have a KT76A transponder.
Bruce, how did you get interested in aircraft?
Well, I became interested right out of high school, and in February of 1968, I soloed and found that that's what I wanted to do. And so I went ahead and got my private, my commercial, and instrument and multi-engine rating. And by 1970, I had my flight instructor rating, and I was an active full-time instructor. And of course, I've seen some of these World War II airplanes, as any young person would dream to fly a World War II airplane. I did too.
And you were hooked, huh?
And then I got hooked, and I was very lucky and was able to fly some of these World War II airplanes. Started off in a Stearman and T6, and by 1973 I was flying P-51s, and then started flying other warbirds like B-25s and A-26 Invaders and DC-3s, and eventually started flying jets too. And I was in the corporate field and also fly some of the jet warbirds.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About here at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. I'm Betty Wheaton. I'll see you next time.